So I guess the question, be you champion or challenger, that I've been asked to address is, is education, and obviously education covers a myriad, which I'll try to quickly cover, but is education open to digital disruption? And I think the answer to that is one I've been deliberating for 15 years, in pursuit of the answer for 15 years, and apparently I'm going to now answer it in 9.5 minutes. Well, I think the first reason why the for-profit sector is so fixated with education, despite all its challenges, is the sheer size of it. So the global size of education, and I take these numbers somewhat with a pinch of salt, is 5.5 trillion. However, it's important to remember most of that money is government spend, which will never be privatized. So, the private sector, can it really compete for maybe 10% of that number? I would argue probably. And the reality is that's a $550 billion number, so that's a pretty significant global market. If you then look at technology within that, or e-learning within that, you're talking about more like 3%, which again, it's a $150 billion market. It's actually growing. It's the fastest growing subsegment of the market. So these are enormous numbers. Consequently, education entrepreneurs are not a new phenomenon. And for-profit companies have been chasing this market for many, many years, myself included. The challenge, however, is, to read this great quote, most of what we have today is very much like an Egyptian pyramid with millions of bricks piled on top of each other with no structural integrity, but just done by brute force and thousands of slaves. So people have been selling technology into the public sector across the world for years, but they've been selling version 2.0 on top of version 1.0, 3.0 on top of 2.0, and as a result, you end up with a market that looks a little like this. And I apologize, you probably can't read that, but what that slide is telling you is, the Edtech market is enormously fragmented. There are companies that specialize in student information systems, in learning management systems, in content management systems, in the content itself, done down at an individual curriculum level. So some of the companies you're going to hear speaking after me specialize in math or languages. There are then companies that specialize in assessment and data management. And on the right-hand side of that slide, what you'll see is, you end up with a massively fragmented market. And the reality is, in spite of billions of dollars of investment capital chasing this dream, most companies, and I'm on their side, albeit I'm speaking as a champion, I applaud the challengers because I have been a challenger. In the end of the day, most companies that go into education don't make it for the very simple reason they can't scale. If they're a B2B company, it requires massive cost of distribution and huge product efficacy to make it. If you're a B2C company, it requires an enormous amount of money to build a consumer brand that people trust. And the reality is, the world hasn't really changed in education. I guess we need a little more audio there, folks, but I'm probably aging myself in the room here, but for those of my age or greater, you'll remember a great American movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Passed anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which anyone raised or lowered tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects?
Anyway, my point is, education, unfortunately, hasn't really benefited from technology investment like other sectors. I mean, you look at the healthcare industry. This is a world-famous French surgeon who saved thousands of lives during World War I with pioneering techniques. Could he actually survive in a 2015 operating theater? He would be an alien. He wouldn't even know where to begin. However, the reality is, look at a teacher. A teacher could be transported from 1920 and land in most classrooms across the world in 2015, and they'd probably know exactly where to pick up the chalk, the blackboard, the marker, the whiteboard, and teach math, teach science, teach English, etc. So I think to just contextualize what I'm trying to say, yes, education is an enormous market. You can make a lot of money if you can find a niche, but there is no Google in education today. There is no Apple in education. The question is, will those companies ultimately come into education, or are they too consumer-centric? They're not seen to have the neuroscience and the pedagogy to be successful in this sector, or maybe they will be. But today, it's a huge market. Lots of people are chasing it. But what you're selling into is a very, very conservative market culturally, and you're selling into a marketplace that has a very high degree of skepticism towards technology, because fundamentally, The school systems around the world have spent billions, but it hasn't created a new defining operating system or a new defining curriculum standard of any significance. And the fact is, it's very tough for people to metric it and show what sort of ROI they've actually gained from their technology investment. So I guess to try and give some sort of a helpful roadmap as to where to take all this, the way I think about education is I think you got to break it into its subcomponents. I think you got to ask yourself, first of all, are you an incumbent delivering traditional products and services, or are you a new entrant trying to deliver, a digital product or service? And then you got to break the market down into its sub-quadrants. Emerging markets, the international market, the US market. Are you selling into the government system? Are you selling into the corporate market B2B, or are you selling to the consumer B2C? And within each of those, obviously, you can then break it into, are you targeting children of a young age group, pre-K? Are you doing K-12? Are you doing K-20? Are you doing higher ed? Are you doing... So it's an enormous market, but having played and invested in companies in most of these quadrants, the quadrant I like today most is the emerging markets. Why? Because first of all, across Asia in particular, there is a huge cultural bias towards education. Remember, there is, a very undefined and very underfunded social welfare system across most of Asia. The child is the pension for the parent. And so as a percentage of their disposable income, they spend more money on education than we do in the West. That is fact. Places like South Korea, highest per capita GDP spend on education in the world. Also happen to be amongst the smartest students in the world. Also the largest cohort in Ivy League schools in America. These aren't coincidental facts. So I very much like the emerging markets as a place where you can make money because there's a cultural acceptance of education, and secondly, there's real underlying growth. And the reason why I like B2C is because you can at least get into that marketplace without having to go through 100 years of product efficacy and without having to build an army of salespeople. And so what I've been doing for the last few years is specializing in early childhood learning centers, which we set up originally in China. So we started franchising a technology-based program, teaching young kids English before they go to school, and then teaching kids between the ages of 5 and 10 as a supplemental program after school. Selling exclusively to the consumer. So not looking for any form of public sector funding, not looking for any form of government aid. Selling, initially we set it up in China. Initially we did it via franchise. We ultimately decided, to control the outcomes in education, you actually have to deliver the product yourself and implement it properly. And so between 2008 and 2013, we built a business in China, which is a blend of old and new. It's a blend of a traditional setting of a learning center, but with a pad that the child gets to take home, with traditional books, but also with a high degree of technology in terms of the delivery of the instruction, as well as in terms of the management of the data and the outcomes. And so we set that business up with initially very little capital, 5 million of initial capital, and then we franchised, which gave us an incremental 5 million of capital, and then we sold that business within 5 years to Bain Capital a little over a year ago for a couple of $100 million. So you can make money in education, and like any entrepreneurial story and like any entrepreneurial journey, there's a large degree of luck required, which we clearly got because between 2008 and 2013, China was, the underlying economy in China was incredibly strong. But I think the reason why ultimately we delivered something that worked and beat the local competitors as well as beat international companies like Disney is because we were able to position our product as having real neuroscientific, pedagogically sound, university accredited content that was delivering something that then the parent themselves could measure and track as an outcome. So now what am I doing? We sold the business in China, as I said, a little over a year ago. So effectively, we're replicating what we did in China and a bunch of other countries where I believe the underlying consumer story and the underlying market demand is the same. So we've set up joint ventures in places like South Korea, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, the Middle East, across the Gulf, and about to go into Brazil and Mexico. So to just finish, I guess the question I've been asked to answer is technology a disruptor in education? And ultimately, can and how do you make money from that journey? Well, I guess I would answer, is technology a disruptor in education? As a consumer offering, yes, potentially, but it's enormously expensive. And so your challenge is, how do you create an education brand, consumer brand? Is it ever going to be a true disruptor in the public schools and in the public universities and across the public sector where most of that 5.5 trillion gets spent? I would frankly answer no. It'll be an enabler, but ultimately there is a social contract between parent, teacher, and student that will never be disintermediated, in my opinion, by education. I think nothing will replace the social contract, the desire to learn, and the will to teach. Thank you very much indeed.